가구를 함께 쓴다는 건 생활을 함께 한다는 것. 오늘도 우리는 하루 정도는 합니다. Your Excellency Abdullah Shahid, President of the 76th United Nations General Assembly, Your Excellency Secretary General Antonio Guterres, Your Excellency President Moon Jae-in, and distinguished leaders from around the world. It is an honor to be here today. We're BTS, appointed as Special Presidential Envoys of the Republic of Korea. We're here today to share the stories of our future generation. Before we came here, we asked the young people in their teens and 20s around the world about their past 2 years and about the world they find themselves in today. Jin will share some of the answers we received. Yes, should we take a look? You can feel the good vibes from just looking at these. There were times during the past 2 years when I too felt bewildered and troubled. But still here, we have people who cry out, let's live on, let's make the best of this moment. Because we can't stand still when we are in the ideal time of our lives to take on new challenges. It wasn't as if we could blame anyone, and you must have felt the frustration. Here I'm the same as I was yesterday, but the world changed, like we were transported in a flash to a parallel world. I was saddened to hear that entrance and graduation ceremonies had to be canceled. These are moments in life you want to celebrate, and missing out on them must have been upsetting. We were heartbroken when our long-planned concert tours were canceled. And for a while, we yearned for the moments we wanted to make complete. Yes, it was a time for us to mourn for the things that COVID took away from us. A time to discover how precious each and every moment we taken for granted were. Suga mentioned the precious things we're taken for granted. And lots of people answered our question, but probably the artist that is most loved by people around the world. Who have been designated as the Special Presidential Envoy for Future Generations and Culture. We're going to listen to their story, the BTS.
Okay, so an achievement for BTS. And I heard about this morning, of course, and I was trying to make sense of it. And let me tell you how I make sense of this kind of events here at the United Nations with President Moon Jae-in of South Korea appealing and using the appeal of K-pop. K-pop and BTS is a K-pop band, and its appeal all over the world, And I think one way to understand what Moon Jae-in is doing here is reflecting the fact that in this world of nuclear weapons and critical interdependency among all the countries and peoples of the world, that anything we do affects us, everyone else. And that's always been true, but it's been more and more obvious to more and more people as interdependency becomes more and more clear in the middle of crises like the COVID-19 pandemic, right? You hear again and again and again the comments that we are all not safe and healthy unless everyone is safe and healthy. You and I are not safe and healthy unless we vaccinate everyone in Africa and Asia and other poor areas, because if the virus continues to circulate, it will continue to evolve and mutate, and new mutations like the Delta variation will emerge. And so it's critically important that we be concerned about the well-being and influence and impact of and thinking of other people, because the behavior and thinking and well-being of other people clearly has an impact on my and our well-being. And that has always perhaps been true, but the point I want to emphasize that we are becoming more and more and more aware of this fact among more and more and more people, not just the elite, not just the college professors, not just the scholars. Everyone around the world is being faced with this fact. And many people react positively by being more cooperative and using the United Nations and focusing upon liberal frameworks for approaching global affairs, including United Nations institutions like the World Health Organization and the economic institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. But other people also respond negatively with more hostility, and they become more nationalistic. And you see that producing responses that support people like Donald Trump in the United States. Reactionary populist nationalism, hostile to COVID-19 vaccines, engaging in denial that there is a deadly virus, seeking conspiracies and wanting to believe that it's the result of a Chinese military laboratory releasing the virus. That's a nationalist hostile response to the ineluctable, inevitable fact that we are all interdependent. And this became most clear, or began to become more and more clear to more and more people with the development of nuclear weapons, right? And countries were in conflict with each other in the past. They would fight wars. They would fight wars in the past if conflicts as intense as the Cold War emerged. In the past, intense conflicts like the Cold War, that were as intense as the Cold War, they would result in war between the great powers, between Prussia and France or Russia and England. It would result in war. When you had conflicts as intense as the kind of intense conflict that we had between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. But then you see that, of course, resolving our conflicts on the battlefield, that became more problematic when the 1945 nuclear atomic bombs were dropped on Japan. At that point, it became clear to more and more people that we have to, in some fundamental ways, limit our competition, control our conflicts with each other, even in some ways cooperate with each other if we want to try to prevent suicide, mass suicide in the form of nuclear weapons and nuclear war. If we let conflicts spiral out of control because of fear and insecurity, and accidents typically happen, right? People in the military at the lower levels of a military unit, they make mistakes, they do things they shouldn't do. The other military people that are suffering the consequence of an attack. I mean, that's what we always talk about with regard to North and South Korea, right? That there are thousands of artillery guns pointed at Seoul right now. What if one drunken North Korean soldier fires off one of those artillery guns at Seoul? Out of all those thousands of artillery pieces pointed at Seoul, some drunken soldier fires off a shell and hits the Kim Soo-won building here and kills you and me. And then it causes panic, it causes fear, and it could escalate out of control as all of these military organizations begin to implement their plans that they have written down and practiced with for involving hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of people as to respond to and act when there is a military attack from North Korea. And then the South Koreans respond. The North Koreans also then respond to that action, and things can escalate out of control. And this is something about what happened leading up to World War I. This is how World War I happened, right? That fear and panic and insecurity produced a conflict spiral among countries in Europe that were basically all defensively motivated, but were fearful and unsecure and panicking regarding the actions of their enemies, who they were afraid were going to get an advantage if they themselves did not each react and respond as quickly as possible. Rather than wait, move quickly, or else, because if you wait too long, the other side will get an advantage in mobilization and destroy you at the beginning of the war. So the point I'm trying to make is that in the nuclear era, conflict and competition for influence among the great powers happens increasingly through indirect ways. It doesn't happen directly, it happens indirectly. And that includes the appeal to and efforts to influence other countries by influencing their publics, not just their governments, but the people inside the target of country that you're trying to influence. Try to influence the business people, the young people. Engage in propaganda and public relations campaigns. Global Korea, K-pop. Try to influence the other countries of the world through influencing the publics and the peoples of those countries more and more directly, because that lessens the likelihood of direct conflict between the two governments who control the militaries, their air forces and the armies and the navies. So, and I think that's one way to explain what you see with this greater impact, for example, on competition, not just, of course, cultural competition like K-pop, but like vaccine nationalism. Which country, China or the United States, is most effective in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic? Who has the best model? Who is going to be more successful in appealing to African and Asian countries and Latin American countries that are struggling with now the COVID-19 pandemic, and in the future, or now, all of the escalating problems that come from global climate change? These poor countries already face tremendous problems in trying to develop themselves, right? And now they have to do with the COVID-19 pandemic and the increasing weather catastrophes occurring because of global warming. And they still are trying to develop themselves out of poverty and give their populations a brighter, more prosperous future with better jobs, more income. Now they have all of these other problems to address on top of the original problems before the pandemic and before global climate change. Who has the best model? Who is most appealing to these countries? The United States or China? China, with its one-party state, they claim that they've resolved the COVID-19 pandemic, and they're still a poor country. When you divide the size of the Chinese economy by the size of the population, they're still a middle-income country, right? They're not anywhere near as prosperous as the United States in terms of population. So again, that's what we call vaccine nationalism, this competition to show the rest of the world which model is the best. And that you see that being always used by Joseph Biden, President Joseph Biden of the United States, continually repeats over and over again to the American people and to the US Congress, as he's appealing to the US Congress to approve his foreign policy and domestic policy strategies, that we have to demonstrate to the world that democracy can work, that democracy can solve these problems. He says it again and again and again, and often he explicitly references China. China has another model, a one-party totalitarian dictatorship that in 45 years is gone from being desperately poor to the second biggest economy in the world, and has dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic, has a space program, has sent a rover to Mars, after in just 45 years when they were still desperately poor after the Cultural Revolution and death of Mao Zedong. And now we're going into a period of more and more crises, worsening climate crisis, weather disasters from more intense hurricanes and floods and droughts, pandemics. Which model is the best? And this reflects the fact that the United States can't just go to war with China and show the world America's best because we beat them on the battlefield, the way Hitler did with France in 1940. You can't do that anymore because you will kill everybody with nuclear weapons. So they're competing indirectly, including soft power. Which model is most appealing? Which model offers the most benefits for your country's development? And I think this reflects a combination of what we were going to cover this week regarding foreign policy models and I want to make sure we open up the files for chapter 3 of the textbook. And you know, and I know we need to do the smart attendance, but I just want to make sure I give an introduction as to why I showed you the BTS intro by Moon Jae-in. What was Moon Jae-in doing? I mean, Moon Jae-in obviously is trying to influence the rest of the world to like South Korea, to support South Korea, to work with South Korea. BTS is famous everywhere. I'm reading all about BTS in the American news media. Why did he do that? Why did Moon Jae-in choose to do that? Because this is how you compete in a world in which, you know, threatening and using deadly force is increasingly a mutual suicide pact. Even conventional war is too destructive, is too violent. I mean, right? I mean, it's when you think about the destructiveness of conventional weapons, war as a way of resolving our conflicts, as a way of competing for influence in the world, threatening and using military force, it's becoming obsolete. That's not to say it can't happen, because accidents do happen and they happen frequently. But increasingly we see countries competing indirectly with each other by appealing to their publics, to their broader communities, their polities, to like them. And so chapter 3 of the Hook textbook begins to talk about these different theoretical perspectives for trying to explain, in this case, US foreign policy. US foreign policy as an example or a case study of international relations. And so there are certain assumptions that go into each of these different theoretical perspectives for explaining American foreign policy or South Korean foreign policy or Russian or Chinese foreign policy. And the dominant perspective has been realism. Hans Morgenthau was one of the founders of realism, which emphasizes that states are the main actors, and they are competing with each other for influence in a world in which the world is always close to violence, because there is no global government to regulate behavior between the states, and the states are the main actors, not the international organizations like the United Nations. No, states. States use international organizations, but realism has certain assumptions about human nature that are pretty bleak, are pretty dark, that human beings are driven to dominate and influence each other because they just like to dominate and influence each other, right? But they will often try to engage in propaganda, not only to each other, but to themselves as to why they want to dominate and control each other, right? So we talked about nationalistic universalism. We talked about how expansionist countries always claim that what they want in the world is good, not just for Washington or Moscow or Beijing, but it's good for the entire human race. If we spread American hegemony around the whole planet. And for some reason, the Taliban didn't believe that. But of course, but liberalism is another worldview, another general worldview on political behavior, liberalism or liberal theory, that more emphasizes the cooperative tendencies in human nature, that human beings are not naturally bad. Oh, of course, you always have bad people. You have bad decision makers. You have bad Kim Il-sungs and Kim Jong-uns and Saddam Husseins and Slobodan Milosevic's and Joseph Stalin's and Adolf Hitler's. And you have their supporters who empower these gangster criminals. But those people get all of the press. They get all the news coverage. But most of the time, most of international relations is peaceful and cooperative. Is peaceful and cooperative. Because if you include, for example, the trade and international commerce and international business, like international entertainment business, like BTS and K-pop, that's 80% of a human being's existence is cooperation for material benefit, for pleasure, for prosperity, for profit. And that typically involves cooperation. 80% of international relations, just like 80% of human interaction in general, is economic based, and that requires cooperation. If you want to do business in China, then there has to be some degree of trust in China. If you want to make long-term business strategy there, if you're the Chinese government and you want to attract companies to invest in China, they've got to be able to trust that there is some degree of rule of law, that what you say now will be in force 5 years from now. And that if you're IBM or Microsoft or Apple and you invest in China, that the Chinese government is not going to just take your factory away from you and claim it for themselves and give it to some Chinese person. No, there has to be some degree of trust and cooperation. Win-win outcomes require cooperation, and liberalism emphasizes that cooperation. But you know, cooperation is boring. Right? What does the news media cover? Does the news media cover that today India and China engaged in $100 million worth of business transactions? No. What do you see instead in the international media? Conflict between India and China, or conflict between US and Beijing, right? But even every day as we speak, the United States and China engage in hundreds of millions of dollars of business and financial transactions, hundreds of millions every day. But that's boring because it's not conflictual. The media coverage covers conflict. Conflict is sexy. Conflict is interesting. But cooperation happens all of the time, and it's not emphasized because we take it for granted. But liberalism emphasizes that there are strong tendencies that people have to cooperate, particularly as they become more enlightened and aware about their need to cooperate for their own benefit and for even their own survival, like in dealing with the anthropogenic global climate change. There needs to be cooperation between China and the United States and the Europeans and South Korea and Japan to address this global crisis. And they have to cooperate, and they have to be able to trust each other to some degree, and they know this. And you know what? They probably will address this conflict. They probably will address this issue. And of course, for a prescription for trying to get rid of war, and the threat of deadly force and the use of deadly force in international relations, liberal theorists say, let's emphasize that. Let's emphasize the cooperation and the organizations for cooperation that already exist, like the United Nations and Bretton Woods institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. Let's build upon those and develop them further and make regional organizations like the European Union that want to promote these international organizations and what they call the rule of law in international relations to address and resolve disputes, so that we make not just 80% of human interaction peaceful, 85%, 90%, 95%, and maybe even 100% of human interaction and conflicts being resolved without threat and use of deadly force. Now, and so this is highlighted in this chapter, right? Structural realism is this focus upon, realists, structural realists are also called neo-realists. They're also called neo-realists. Point out that, yeah, Ben, they might say to me, yeah, Ben, you're right. But you know what makes that cooperation happen? The overwhelming power and dominance of the United States after World War II. The United States created these Bretton Woods organizations like the IMF and the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund. The United States gave peace to Europe because the Europeans, they're not any better than they used to be until 1945. Europeans have been fighting and preparing and recovering for war for 1,000 years before 1945. Europe has been a scene of war, either fighting war, preparing for war, or recovering for war for 1,000 years until 1945. Why did the Europeans stop killing each other? Was it because suddenly their human nature changed? That they go, oh, guess what? We understand now that war is bad. And so, no, structural realists would say. Europeans, French and Germans have stopped worrying about killing each other because the Americans are there. Because the American military and America's commitment of its financial resources is there. That's why French and Germans and even Japanese and Koreans don't kill each other. It's not because Japanese and Koreans suddenly like each other. It's not because human nature suddenly changed. It's because there's 50,000 US soldiers in Japan and 29,000 now in South Korea. That's why South Koreans and Japanese cooperate. Not because they have a natural inclination towards cooperation. It's because the Americans are there with their military and their democracy and their capitalism. Let's be honest about what are the sources of peace in the world. And so America's hegemony, America's influence is benign and nice. It's not like Soviet Russian hegemony in Eastern Europe that was kept in force with the KGB and the Soviet Red Army and terror. It's not like Hitler's hegemony in Germany when he was conquering Germany. American influence and dominance is a different kind of influence and dominance. But it's still based upon America's willingness to build a vast military with lots of military bases all over the world to overcome the security dilemma in the form of anarchy in international relations, requiring states to only take care ultimately of themselves because nobody else will. But this means if you are in a system of anarchy where there is no world government, that if you will have to prepare and build a military just in case, my neighbor is nice today, but who knows who's going to rule in Germany tomorrow if you're France. You got to be prepared that tomorrow a bad guy might come to power again in Germany and then attack you with their army. So you build up your army. And of course, if I build up my army, that makes my neighbor nervous because maybe today I'm a nice guy, but tomorrow I can be a bad guy. But I have this army. So this leads to the security dilemma that my efforts to prepare for worst case scenarios in a system of anarchy, in a self-help system, in a system of self-help where there is no world government that can take care of my security for me, I have to prepare for the worst scenario, and that generates threat to my neighbor. That is the security dilemma. How do I increase my security without decreasing the security of my neighbor? And the American hegemony in Europe and in East Asia overcomes that security dilemma because there is not anarchy in Europe and Asia. There is not anarchy because the Americans are there with their hundreds of military bases and their vast military, together with their appealing capitalist development model and their relatively open political system that includes transparency, democracy, freedom of the media and the press, human rights, and non-governmental organizations that are monitoring what the US is doing. It's a different kind of hegemony. So realism structural realism emerged to try to explain the world after World War II. And that, World War II happened because of anarchy, like we talked about the three levels of analysis, right? According to Man, the State, and War of Kenneth Waltz, that why did World War II happen? Partly because nobody was in charge in Europe. There was no overarching dominant actor that could motivate and incentivize the states of Europe to cooperate with each other so they stopped stabbing each other in the back economically and politically. Now there is, because America is there. And this is an American theory. This is Kenneth Waltz. Kenneth Waltz is the founder of, he's the main, most well-known proponent, theorist. He died 10 years ago, but he's the main proponent or theorist of structural realism in his 1977 work, Theory of World Politics. And it's controversial, but this is the dominant view in the United States. And you can say that it might be kind of self-serving, right? Because it serves to justify why, you know, you're taking this class in English, and this university here, Catholic University of Korea, is an American style university, and why there's 29,000 soldiers in South Korea and 50,000 soldiers in Japan and thousands of American soldiers in Belgium and in Western Europe, because it overcomes the anarchy of international relations to circumvent the security dilemma. Political leaders confront a security dilemma. It results from ambiguity of each major state's motives, right? Everybody's got an army because you got it. Nobody's going to take care of you but you, ultimately. And you know that, and I know that. So today I got an army, and you might trust my motives, but tomorrow I could be a different government with a bad leader, and my motives will change. But I have that military. So each state leadership always claims that they only want to defend themselves. Everybody always claims they only want a military for defense. Everybody since 1945 calls their Ministry of Defense the Ministry of Defense, right? Or the Department of Defense, like in the United States Department of Defense. But until 1940s, it was the War Department in the United States. And then the name was changed, I think, in 1948. The War Department became the Defense Department. Now, in everybody in the world, they have a Defense Department or Ministry of Defense. But in the United States, it was the War Department because war was legal. War was a legitimate legal way to resolve your disputes into at least the early part of the 20th century. Countries could legally go to war with each other, and they did. So the Americans had a War Department. But then, of course, with the horrors of World War II, everybody at least made a promise that they're not going to use force to promote their interests, to advance their influence, only in self-defense, only in self-defense. So whenever the US goes to war, or any country goes to war, it's self-defense for themselves or defense for their neighbors or friends who are under attack from an evil enemy. Always defense of somebody since 1945. And that's embodied in the UN Charter. So again, though, why don't the Taliban, why don't the Afghanistan people understand that? Why don't they understand how benign and wonderful American hegemony is? What's wrong with Afghanistan people? Why don't they understand how benign American hegemony is? And the Americans are struggling with this. I mean, obviously the Germans and the Japanese learned, right? The Americans came in and helped build new democracies in Japan and Germany. Why couldn't we do that in backward, poverty-stricken, weak Afghanistan? And the Americans are arguing and fighting about this right now. So liberal theory and realist theory are often combined to explain why American hegemony supposedly is benign. Yeah, America overcomes the security dilemma, but American hegemony is nice in Europe, at least in Europe and Eastern Asia, because American hegemony is hegemonic. And Americans are still struggling, are going to struggle for a long time to understand what is the problem Americans have in the Middle East. And I think the problem, of course, in the Middle East is that the Americans basically are enemies of national self-determination, or perceived as such in the Middle East, in terms of Iranian nationalism, Arab nationalism, and Islamic self-determination, because the Americans are adversaries to pan-Arabism, and they opposed Iranian nationalism, and that led to the rise of Ayatollah Khomeini in the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979. And now America's continue to ally with the Israel lobby, which of course is threatened by pan-Arabism. So the Americans have allied with the corrupt sheikhs and traditional elites ruling the Jordan and Saudi Arabia and the oil sheikdoms against pan-Arabism, and as a consequence, and pan-Islamism, and as a consequence, America's lost in Afghanistan. And question is, will it lose elsewhere? And ultimately, I think it will, but it's going to be a horribly bloody process. And it's going to go on over years and generations. But that's just my. I mean, when you think about how powerful the power of nationalism is, I mean, the Americans could not impose their will in Afghanistan. That's a country of 40 million people. It's not even the size of South Korea in population. It's got 15 different ethnic groups. Half of the 15 are Turkic and the other half are Persian Farsi, and they don't like each other. And they defeated the United States. And nobody was really helping the Taliban. There was no Soviet Union giving weapons to the North Vietnamese, the way the North Vietnamese were getting weapons and assistance from the Soviet Union and China to fight the Americans. There was no China and Soviet Union giving weapons to the Taliban, the way the Chinese in the South and the Soviet Union were giving weapons to Kim Il-sung in North Korea. And yet the Taliban still defeated the United States. Who was helping them? No one. Different groups, they were using their own weapons left over. I mean, it's really shocking and quite amazing. And it's not so surprising to me because I've been studying this for years with my old professor. But Americans, they don't want to hear this. So, but this is the argument made that somehow America combined in its influence the best of liberalism and the reality of realism in its strategy to bring peace to Europe and to East Asia. Liberalism emphasizes interdependence, that if you want to develop and grow your economy, you need to do trade and business with everybody else. Your economic well-being depends upon my economic well-being. My economic well-being depends upon your economic well-being. Interdependence. And this, of course, it includes interdependence in terms of security, that if the world allows, say, conflicts between, let's say, Pakistan and India. Pakistan and India both have nuclear weapons. The Americans have to be concerned about the Pakistan and India conflict, because if they continue to be in intense conflict, they're going to develop more nuclear weapons. They're going to look for allies and aid, and there could be a nuclear accident. There could be a revolution in Pakistan, and in that highly authoritarian, large country with great degree of corruption. What if some of those nuclear weapons fall into someone's control that the Americans don't want to have those nuclear weapons? So America has to be concerned about conflicts, but like between India and Pakistan, for its own well-being. And that, again, may have always been true, but now it's becoming more and more obvious to more and more people. And some will say, yes, we have to cooperate. Others go, no. They deny it, like Donald Trump supporters. So, liberalism emphasizes the need for global governance. It emphasizes the need for being concerned about human rights abuses in China or United States or Russia, or that these are issues of concern because our interdependence, not just because we want to be nice people, but because it impacts my well-being. That if China, as the argument goes, the United States abuses its own people, that somehow there's an important relationship between how a government treats its own people and how that government will treat other countries. That was the justification for including human rights in the United Nations Charter at the end of World War II, right? That somehow that there was a direct connection between Adolf Hitler's regime in Germany, between how it treated its own people and abused its minorities and groups there, and its aggressive nature to other countries, to its neighbors. And so for purposes of world security and stability, we have to be concerned with what is going on inside the internal conditions of other countries. We have to be concerned about that because it impacts ultimately my well-being. And that's a 20th century legal development. Classical international law until World War II said how your government and you treat your people and your government in your country is not my business as an outside country. It's not legally my obligation or my right to be involved in what's going on inside your country. That changed because of the 20th century, and particularly the Second World War. And around that commitment that was first expressed clearly in the United Nations Charter, you saw global civil society organizations emerge, like Amnesty International, as a human rights global international organization that is monitoring and looking at what the Americans are doing regarding American people, what the Chinese are doing in terms of treating their people, including their minorities, and so on and so on. And Greenpeace is focused upon economic, environmental issues, because obviously what China does in terms of how it develops, or what India does in terms of how it burns fossil fuels to develop its economy for the well-being of its people, is going to impact the rest of the world. And we all are increasingly seeing that. So, there was some of these, again, the Stephen Hook textbook is written for an American audience. And again, international relations theory has been dominated by American experience and American thinking. And structural realism, as I told you, that is the dominant perspective, not the only perspective, but the dominant perspective in studying international relations in the United States and American universities. And it's the dominant view, I think, in the establishment, on the foreign policy establishment in the United States. That includes professors and government officials and former government officials and policy analysis institutions, which you call think tanks, the quote unquote foreign policy establishment, right? This is the dominant view, that American hegemony is good because it overcomes the security dilemma, and it's effective because it's liberal. And so, yeah, America makes mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. Human beings make mistakes. That's what humans do. But we have to work and develop and modify and build upon the achievements that the United States created from 1945 to make them more effective and more successful. Sure, the Americans make mistakes. Yeah. But we don't throw out everything that the Americans achieved. We have to modify it. NATO is good. NATO should not be abolished. NATO should be expanded into Kyrgyzstan and into the former Soviet republics. And NATO should play a role in Afghanistan, in the Middle East, because NATO, led by the United States, brought peace to Europe that for 1,000 years had been at war with itself. We should expand American money and through the International Monetary Fund and American financial dominance, so that the world can have a de facto common single currency money for international business, and that is the dollar. And that means you need a government to back up that dollar, and that means the United States. That's the dominant view in the United States regarding America's position in the world. And this is also manifested in this notion of democratic peace, right? Again, this is an American idea that emerged back in the 1980s, that democracies don't go to war with each other, that developed democracies don't go to war with each other. And supposedly that means if the Americans invade and put democracies and establish democracies in Afghanistan and Iraq, there will be more peace in Afghanistan and Iraq, in the Middle East, because democratic states like America will not go to war with democratic states like Germany and democratic Japan and a democratic Afghanistan and a democratic Iraq and so on. And so America should promote democracy, if necessary, by getting rid of those evil, bad, criminal gangsters like Saddam Hussein and Bashar al-Assad and Kim Jong-un, or his father, Kim Jong-il, when he was alive. It's bad governments led by bad people. Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran. Get rid of that, the Muslim clerics ruling the semi-totalitarian dictatorship in Iran, and the world will become more peaceful. And by the way, Israel's a democracy. And so, Israel. Yeah, they treat their Palestinians bad, but that's their fault, because the Arabs refuse to accept the fact that Israel has a right to exist. That's what they say. And some of you who are, in European Union classes, you've read about or heard about Immanuel Kant, Perpetual Peace. He was making this argument back at the end of the 18th century, the great philosopher from Königsberg, Germany, what is today Kaliningrad, Russia, that Königsberg, Prussia, if the European states were ruled by democratic governments, then they'd be less likely to go to war with each other, because these aristocratic feudal dictatorships, they justify their authoritarian rule because they claim that we are the ancient Yangban of Germany or France, and our specialty is war. We are the warrior class, and we live in a world in which you need people like me to dominate Germany and France and Japan, because the world's a bad place. So I should be in power as the samurai of Japan, or the Junker class of Germany, because the world's a bad place. And of course, it's self-serving, and they use it to justify their continuing domination in their feudal, despotic, outmoded, archaic political and economic system. So if you get rid of those people, get rid of the kings and the shahs and the emperors and the sultans and the gangsters like Saddam Hussein and the gangster criminals like Kim Il-sung and Saddam Hussein, get rid of those gangster criminal mafia aristocratic and modern and contemporary regimes, and allow the people to express their natural desire to cooperate, to better themselves and their lives for themselves and for their children through capitalism and democracy, and we will spread peace through the world. And this goes back to Woodrow Wilson, Wilsonian democracy theory, that World War I was a war fought to make the world safe for democracy, to get rid of the Kaiser in Germany and the Sultan in the Ottoman Empire and the Emperor in the Habsburg Empire. And of course, then the Russian Emperor gets overthrown in 1917, the Tsar. And now World War I is a war to end all wars by making the world safe for democracy, and the world will be peaceful. And of course, we know that we had World War II. But again, the American explanation is that, yeah, we had World War II because the Americans left Europe after World War I was over. They entered World War I, and then Germany was defeated, and then they left. And the result was fascism, Nazism, and World War II. So now the Americans must not leave Asia and Europe. And they should expand in the Middle East and do in the Middle East what they did in Europe and what they did in East Asia, and bring peace to the Middle East. So the Cold War helped create the North Atlantic Community and European integration, a security community building on an informal system of military and economic cooperation, making war between North American and West European countries unthinkable. Like, we can't even think about, it's not even imaginable, war between France and Germany today. It's like, yay, America. US hegemony endures, unlike Nazi Germany hegemony or Soviet hegemony, because the nature of US international power applies the tools of capitalist economic development and aspirations for liberal democratic mass political participation. Yay! And this guy, Eikenberry, he's the main, he's a professor, I think, at Princeton. He's the guy always promoting this. He pops up during the pandemic on Zoom conferences like I attended last year. He's always saying this: America established a liberal economic order, and over and over again. And then poof, America's ally in Kabul just disappears. I want to talk to Mr. Eikenberry. Like, how do you explain? Oh my gosh. So, okay, and then there's a third perspective. There's realist, general paradigm perspective with the variations like structural realism, and there are other forms of realism, but structural or neorealism is the main dominant force. Hans Morgenthau promoted classical realism. Neoclassical realism is another perspective. It emphasizes more the role of strategy, which I like to apply. And then there's liberalism. And then there's a third perspective called constructivism that basically focuses upon the ideas and images and institutions that people have in their brains, right? That focus upon how the world changes. Like constructivism really emphasizes, how does the world change? Why is change inevitable? What is the nature of change in politics, international relations? What is the nature of change in identity, right? Remember, when you're born, when I am born, when I was born, I was not born an American. I was constructed into being an American. When I was born, I was taught English. I was born in American society. I was getting all of this information and data coming into my newly developing brain. And I was socialized by my family, by the environment, and I was constructed to become an American. If I had been kidnapped when I was born, at the time I was born and taken to Germany, I would not be American. I would have been constructed a German. You were constructed as Koreans, you were constructed as Belgians, you were constructed as Walloons or Flems, whatever, but we're all constructed. And the question is, can we construct something new? Like you Europeans, can we construct a European identity that is intense and maybe the most important identity that overcomes our German or French or Italian or Bulgarian or Greek identity to build something new that is can we construct a European identity that exists not just in terms of our thinking, but in terms of our emotions, our affect, our heart? Because remember, this change in identities and prevailing identities happens over time. I mean, like I tell my students, right? If you were born 1,000 years ago in what is today France, you would not be French. France exists up here. France did not exist up here in the minds of 99% of the people living in what we call France today 1,000 years ago. They didn't know what France was. France is a new thing created a few hundred years ago among the mass of the, well, it existed among the elite for hundreds of years, but it became a mass identity only in the last 300 years. So, and this is trying to emphasize, for example, why are more and more people concerned about human rights in other countries? Why are more and more people willing to devote their careers and their resources to work in non-governmental organizations? Why do more and more people pay attention to the terrible things happening in Sudan against in Darfur, or what's going on in Ebola or pandemic outbreaks in other countries of the world? And so this emphasizes change. And of course, realists and liberals, of course, they understand change happens, but they don't do a very strong job of trying to explain why change happens. These people, these constructivists, they are all about focusing upon how are prevailing assumptions and beliefs and attitudes and identities as values, how are those things created in our brains? Because they're not there when we're born, they're put there. They interact with our DNA because that's a factor of human nature, that we have a predisposition as human beings to want to join groups. That's just part of what we do as Homo sapiens. But typically the groups we're concerned about until 1,000 years ago were very small, like our family or village. Now people fight and die for this thing called China that has 1.2 billion people in it. And they'll get upset if the Americans recognize Taiwan as an independent country from China. And they'll fight over that. Even though they've never been to Taiwan, even though they don't know anybody. If you're Chinese, you might not know anybody from Taiwan. You've never been to Taiwan, but you'll be very angry if the Americans recognize Taiwan as a sovereign independent state and create an American embassy there and maybe put American military base there. You'll be furious. Why are you so furious about that? What's that got to do with your life if you're Chinese? Somehow people think it's got something to do with their lives. Why are you Koreans so upset about Dok Island and the East China Sea, or the East Sea or the Sea of Japan, whatever you want to call it? So identity is an important issue because it defines relations among governments. So, constructivism is really focusing upon this notion of identities and political behavior. And how do they evolve and change in different contexts, different situations, different historical periods. And how do perceptions and attitudes change in the midst of conflict and crises? How is it that Americans can so quick, and any people can go from one time feeling intensely hostile towards certain groups of people, and then the situation and context changes, and then they become friends and allies with those same people that they were at war with several years previously, right? During World War II, the US government was telling its people in the United States, Germans bad, Japanese bad, kill Germans, kill Japanese. And then by 1950, West Germans good, Japanese good, Chinese bad, Chinese bad. During World War II, Chinese good because they were fighting the Japanese. Then in 1950, Chinese bad and Japanese good. And how do people react to that? Why do people respond? So many people respond so quickly or so effectively to American government propaganda. Some don't, many do. Why? And why are some governments more effective at it than others? It's all about nationalism, right? And now we have this global war on terror. Right? What is this global war on terror? What is a terrorist? A war on terror. Terror is a tactic. Terror is a political tactic to get some kind of political outcome, generate some kind of political effect, to generate some kind of consequence. Declaring war on terror is like declaring war on tanks or declaring war on ships. Terror is a tactic, but the United States claimed, they support terrorism, evil. Terror, who supports terrorism, right? You know the old saying, one person's terrorist, another person's freedom fighter. So conflict between US and China. Structural realism emphasizes that it's inevitable that the US prevailing view in US government will be that China is a threat. Why? Because China is becoming more and more powerful. Remember, realists just generally view human motivations and human nature as really focused upon influence and dominance for its own sake. I might lie to you and me about saying, I don't want to dominate and influence people for particular national interests. But the point is that structural realists emphasize that conflict between US and China is inevitable. Because the Americans will not be willing to give up their influence over South Korea or Taiwan as China becomes more and more powerful relative to the United States. And so the US has to strengthen its, and of course the Chinese are no better than the Americans. So they'll claim that they want simply to rectify humiliation and stand up for the non-white peoples of the world that have suffered so much imperialism and racist imperialism by the Europeans and the Japanese, and the Chinese can resonate with that because they've experienced that European and Japanese imperialism. And so the rise of China is good for all of the non-white people of the world in particular, because now we have a non-white power becoming a superpower, and the world is no longer dominated by these racist Europeans. And they come up with their propaganda too, right? And so the response, according to structural realism, will be to strengthen military forces with an emphasis on the Asia-Pacific region and alliances, resist Chinese expansion, and shame China for its human rights abuses. Liberalism emphasizes that the rise of China it can be peaceful through a globalized, interdependent, and constitutional world order. So this is what Joe Biden is talking about today, that China is bad, or it's increasingly a problem because China does not want to follow the rules. The rules, of course, that the Americans helped set up after World War II, that the Chinese are engaged in unfair trade disputes, that they steal intellectual property, that they create military bases and artificial islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, in the South China Sea, that this is violating international rules. China should follow the rules. And of course, we have to continue to convince the Chinese and the Chinese polity, the Chinese public, to cooperate, work with the Chinese business community. And just keep in mind that if liberalism sees China as a problem, liberalism is going to emphasize the fact because it's the Chinese Communist Party that's the problem, because it's not a democracy. The problem with China, it's in a one-party authoritarian state, and to justify its one-party totalitarian control, it's got to tell its Chinese people, we cannot afford democracy because democracy allows the spies and enemies of China to split China, to interfere in Chinese internal affairs and encourage the Tibetans to try to split from China, encourage the Uyghurs to try to split from China. And they've already took Taiwan, and so democracy is bad. And I know, you have to tolerate limits on what we enforce, but it's for the good of China, for China's dignity and respect and rise in the world. So liberalism emphasizes bad governments. And constructivism emphasizes that China is the other, that governments of countries, they like to have an enemy because it helps them stay in power, whether it be China or Washington, Beijing or Washington. Governments of the United States or governments of China, they're looking for enemies because if they can make an enemy, and it's typically, constructivists are heavily influenced by Marxist theory. Constructivists, they tend to be called also neo-Marxists. They tend to be people that are more leftists in their orientation, that they are also skeptical regarding capitalism and capitalism dominating democratic politics, capitalism dominating the news media, capitalism brainwashing people. So constructivists might not necessarily like China, but they're also not so favorable to an American government political system that is really, really answerable to rich, powerful, hidden corporations that hide their influence and use their money to influence politicians and control the media through through advertising and control people's thinking through advertising, marketing, stereotyping. So this tends to be skeptical of Americans as well as towards authoritarians in China and elsewhere. So this, you can say that these two, realism tends to emphasize international system more. Liberalism tends to emphasize state level factors in explaining international behavior more. And constructivism is more focused upon the individual levels of analysis. Remember, we talked about 3 levels of analysis on Kenneth Walt's 1954 book, Man, the State, and War. Structural realism tends to focus upon international systemic level factors. Liberalism tends to focus upon state level factors like, do you have democracy? Do you have capitalism? Governing your economic and political system inside your state. And constructivism is trying to understand what's going on up here in the human mind. And so this book, your textbook, is more focused upon these state level factors of analysis, right? The Hook textbook is not only, but it's not going to spend a long time talking about system level factors. It'll have a chapter on individual decision making, but this book is mostly upon American state level factors of analysis, the nature of the US government, the separation of powers between Congress and the presidency, the role of the media, the role of interest groups, the role of the bureaucracy. These are all state level factors. That's the dominant emphasis of this textbook. Okay, so how was this? I want to, I want to make sure this is all very interesting and topical for you. So I've done a lot of talking for an hour, and I just want to make sure I get these points out there and make them relevant to what's going on today, right? So that, because I want you to love politics. I want you to love studying political issues. And I want you to understand how all of these issues like realism and liberalism, these have made our world. And they affect our well-being, as we're all seeing, for example, on how we deal with this COVID-19 pandemic. And that requires effective foreign policies. And what are the obstacles for dealing with those effective foreign policies? How has the Cold War created this thing called South Korea? I mean, South Korea is a child of the Cold War. South Korea exists because of the Cold War. And the Cold War, was it inevitable? What happens when the Cold War ends? Soviet Union disappears and China rises. So I'm trying to, I want to make sure that all this information in the book and in the course is something you're thinking about in terms of how does it explain who you are, why you're here in this class, taking it in English in South Korea. Okay, and so, but before I forget, because I will forget, we should do the smart attendance and go stop share and share screen. And let's see if I can go back to the, I'm going to have to open up the Cyber Campus again. And so I have to go back to Cyber Campus. And so just a second, Cyber Campus, where's Cyber Campus? Cyber Campus, okay. So, go here. Share screen, Cyber Campus here. And so I'm going to log out and log back in here, log in, and close this and go to American Foreign Policy and click on vote and not vote, attendance, and go to week 4, smart attendance, and your lucky number is 645. 645 is your lucky number today. And so let me put that in the chat, 645. And there you see that's your smart attendance number. And so please enter that number in. And so how are the Americans trying to understand if their hegemony is so benign, what happened in Afghanistan? And is it going to happen somewhere else like Iraq? Or and so there is a lot of discussion going on right now regarding the blob. And so let me ask you this question. So please respond to the following statement. In 2021, today, September 22nd, 2021, American Cold War containment strategy from 1945 to 1991 has done more good for the world than bad. That America's involvement in the world to produce what exists on September 22nd, 2021, we can say that America's containment strategy and expansion and its hegemony because of the Cold War, even though the Cold War ended 30 years ago when the Soviet Union went poof, that on the whole, the world is a better place. The Americans have done more good for the world than bad for the world since 1945, 30 years after the Cold War ended in 1991, because it was on December 31, 1991, the Soviet Union declared the end of its existence. And so let me divide you into 3 groups. And please join those groups and decide where your group fits on that scale. And just to have the first person each group will speak. So join your three groups, please. And the first person each group will speak for the group as to where the group fits on this scale regarding this question. Do you strongly agree, can't decide, disagree, strongly disagree that American influence has done more good than bad for the world since to the present? Understand, the Americans became so influential around the world because of the belief that, oh my God, the Soviet Union is a Russian version of Nazi Germany, and we have to contain the Soviet Union. And so we'll go to war in Korea, we'll go to war in Vietnam, we will create the International Monetary Fund and the World Trade Organization, and we'll give Marshall Fund, European Recovery Program funds to Belgium and France and Italy and West Germany, and we will help promote the economic development of Japan because we have to contain the Russian version of Nazi Germany with its evil siren song appealing ideology of socialism and doing what the Soviet Union did as a backward country in 1920 after the destruction of World War I and the Russian Civil War. It recovered from the Russian Civil War where millions of people died, and then it became an industrial power, and Germany then invaded it, and the Soviet Union destroyed Germany and recovered by 1950 from the war, and then was the first to put a man in space. And then that might be really appealing to the communist Chinese, to the Chinese suffering from imperialism and poverty, or to the Koreans under Kim Il-sung, or to other peoples all over the world coming out of European racist imperialism in Africa and Asia. And so the Americans said, yes, we will promote capitalism and democracy in Europe, in Asia, all over the world, and we will stop the evil communists with their spies and conspiracies working for Moscow, with their henchmen like Kim Il-sung and Mao Zedong earlier, and Ho Chi Minh, and Salvador Allende in Chile, and Fidel Castro in Cuba, and Patrice Lumumba in Congo, and Mossadegh in Iran. These spies of the Soviet Union, or if not spies, fools who do not understand how evil and conspiratorial the Iranian communists are, or the Korean communists, or the African communists, and they must be suppressed with strong leaders like Pak Chung-hee and Ferdinand Marcos and Augusto Pinochet in Chile, who will suppress the evil communists until the economies of South Korea and Latin America and China and Chile and elsewhere develop and grow. And then you have an emerging middle class under capitalism, and then that middle class will say, we want democracy because we're tired of the inefficiency and insensitivity of bureaucratic military juntas like under Chun Dai-wan that are not very effective in a world where you need rule of law in order to be global. That was supposed to happen in China. That as China developed economically, that there would emerge a middle class in China that would demand more participation in making policy so that China would be more effective in globalizing in the world economy. And of course, the claim is that it hasn't really happened in China, unlike in South Korea, unlike in Taiwan. Okay, so all right, so I'll write a statement as well. And so make sure that everybody's in their groups. And I should choose, where am I going to be on the scale? So let's go back to the scale. So I should participate as well. And so heads is 1, 2, 3. It's heads. Heads is 1, it's tails. Heads is 2, and it's tails. So I'm neutral, cannot decide. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay, so who's going to speak first? So I wrote out my statement. I got to make sure I read this to you. So breakout rooms and close all rooms. You have 60 seconds. Thirty seconds. Okay, so heads is room one, will speak first, and it is tails. Heads is room two, and it's heads. So Tohiri.
Yes.
So what did your group decide in terms of where you are on this scale?
In our group, choose the number 3. Cannot decide it.
And why is that?
I think there's two kinds of opinion in my group. If we back to the before the Cold War, I heard another student that America gave to money to help the Europe to get the democracy. So we thought that this is the good point for this topic, and also we can't like suggest that this specific reason why there is a bad. So I think it's cannot decided that during the American Cold War strategy.
Let me tell you what I wrote, because I also wrote neutral cannot decide. I wrote, I am neutral because I think the United States has done good in the world, like you said, in Europe and East Asia. However, I think the Cold War was a spiral conflict in which the Soviets and the Americans misperceived each other's belligerency as due to aggressive imperialist intent. So they were each trying to contain each other. The US tended to perceive any actor in the developing world, in the third world, in Africa or Asia or Latin America, calling for, that was any actor in the third world calling for radical change as an agent of Moscow, or at best a fool, effectively serving Russia's imperialist motives, even if not intentionally doing so, making it possible, say, for the Iranian Communist Party to seize power on its own because Mohammad Mossadegh won't suppress them, because he's all for democracy and freedom of expression and participation. Consequently, the United States CIA overthrew progressive secular nationalist leaders challenging traditional conservative rulers like the kings of and tribal chiefs and others of the third world. The US CIA overthrew progressive secular nationalist leaders challenging traditional conservatives who had collaborated with London and Paris when they were part of the European empires. As a consequence, secular progressive nationalism failed to deliver national self-determination, leading to the rise of religious sectarian nationalist leaders. Ayatollah Khomeini and the Islamic Revolution in Iran would never have occurred without Operation Ajax by the CIA in 1953 that overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran. All right, I believe that. Ayatollah Khomeini and the Islamic Revolution would not have happened in Iran if the United States had not overthrown Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953, because they thought he was a fool who was letting the Iranian Communist Party have too much free will within Iran to do what it wanted, and it was going to seize power unless the Americans got rid of this fool who was letting them do what they want to do. So, and the nice thing about, since I started studying these issues, is Wikipedia has emerged. So I can show you where there is a Wikipedia entry for Operation Ajax, if you're interested in looking at it more. And it looks pretty good. Somebody produced this who knows a bit about the Middle East. And here is the website for Operation Ajax. Or TPAJ, Ajax Operation. In the United Kingdom, also the MI5, the British were involved in this. And you can see who was involved. Kermit Roosevelt, he was the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt, was involved in all of this. And I know, and here's Mohammad Mossadegh, Prime Minister of Iran, 1951. He was Times Man of the Year. It's not like he was an unknown person. And I know about this because my professor was involved in this as well. Who died 25 years ago. The Tudeh Party was the Communist Party in Iran. And and this happened in Guatemala in 1954 when the US overthrew Arbenz in anybody who was talking in radical terms about changing the political system in these countries was considered to be, if not a Soviet agent, a fool who was allowing and weakening communist influence to come to power. So the United States would overthrow Arbenz, and this would trigger a civil war in Guatemala that would kill like 200,000 people that would go on in the 1990s. And then there was the Bay of Pigs operation, was another big operation that tried to overthrow Castro in Cuba. That was a big CIA operation that failed. There was another major CIA operation in Damascus in 1953, and I don't think there is a Wikipedia entry here for that, that played an important role in the Ba'ath regime coming to power in Syria in 1956. This was also, and this is understudied. My professor said more people need to study this, but this was a big CIA operation that led to the emergence of the Assad family eventually. It's still there. So my point is that my professor thought that the Islamic Revolution in Iran was as important for world history as the French Revolution was in 1789. It was that significant. And the Taliban victory, I think, can be traced back to the rise of political Islam due to the failure of secular Arab nationalism under the Ba'ath Party in Iraq and Syria, and secular Arab nationalism under Nasser in Egypt being stopped or blocked or obstructed by these CIA operations because the CIA thought that anybody who was radical, who wanted to take land from the rich and give it to the poor peasants, they must be working for Moscow. So the US overthrew Mossadegh in Iran. He wasn't Arab, he was Iranian. Nabulsi in Jordan. These were all liberal people in the 50s. These operations happened in the 1950s at the height of the Cold War. And as a result, these secular nationalists look like they're weak, ineffective fools. And what's the answer to be who we are? Islam is the answer. And particularly after Israel humiliates the Arabs in the 1967 Six-Day War in June 1967. Then you see this upsurge of political Islam throughout the Middle East. And it just scored a major victory in Afghanistan. And this worries a lot of people in the US because it's going to encourage it further in the Middle East. I mean, think about it. They defeat the Soviet Union and then they defeat the United States. Okay. And let's go now to heads is group 1, tails is room 3, and tails, Anais. Where does your group fit?
Yes, so it's basically the same as what the other group said. Like we cannot agree because yeah, they did good for Europe and South Korea or Japan, but in other countries they didn't help.
Yeah, I mean, they did good for South Korea. I mean, there's if you want a good English language book, you want to read about the Korean War, I would recommend this book. It's written by an American author. It's short. He's a good writer. The Korean War, A History by Bruce Cummings. And, and it's been translated into Korean language. It came out 11 years ago, 2010. And, he makes the point that, the Korean War was complicated. Kim Il-sung was a genuine hero. But the Americans, allied with the business class, a lot of whom they were like, well, Park Chung-hee, he was an officer in the Japanese army. He graduated #1 in his class in the Japanese military school. he got I think he states in this book that Li Pai, the last emperor of China, who then the Japanese made emperor of Manchukuo, gave Park Chung-hee a gold watch as a gift for his service in Manchukuo in the Japanese Imperial Army. And I always wondered if Park Geun-hye, who's now in jail, she still has that gold watch that Park Chung-hee got from Li Pai. I wonder if she still got the watch that he says he received. So, yeah, difficult topic. I know that I think that the library has a copy of it, of the book in English. So, okay. And so, yeah, but I mean, okay. And then group 3, and let's see, who is group 3? Oh, that's
just one group 3.
Okay, yes, Alisa Shelinik.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, we basically had the same that was already said in the previous groups. We think that for Europe and countries like South Korea, they did good to stop the spread of communism.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, we are kind of of the same opinion.
Yeah. But I'm claiming that the rise of political Islam is due to American Cold War competitive interference in these countries. And Soviet competitive interference. I mean, political Islam defeated the Soviet Union as well in the 1980s with the help of the Americans. And then, of course, it had impact in the United States, because then you have the rise of religious nationalism in America, often focusing upon the Islamic terrorists and Islam's supposed hatred for Christians and desire for jihad to kill all the Christians. That is sort of like a massive blowback consequence of this Cold War competitive interference, where the Americans would play with political Islam in Afghanistan to kill Soviet soldiers in the 1980s. Like Osama bin Laden received material benefits from material support from the United States when he was killing the Russians in Afghanistan, and then he started killing Americans. Political Islam says a pox on both your houses. Go to hell, America, and go to hell, Soviet Union. So, I mean, that's why I keep coming back to the Cold War, even though it ended 30 years ago. And then the Americans, oh, what happened? Why didn't we win in Afghanistan? I mean, we're America. We're not the Soviet Union, we're America. Wow. Okay, so I want to show you a video clip because it's funny. If I can do this without wasting too much time here. No. Yeah, I get lost. Just a second.
Dave, Doc Hallen's been killed. Doc Hallen? What happened? It's over his place. You gotta come now. Oh, wait a minute, Steve. Tell us what happened. Well, I'm trying to tell you. Now, this thing had killed the doc. Well, what was it? Stop with it, kid. But it's kind of like a mass that keeps getting bigger and bigger.
Every one of you watching this screen, look out. Because soon, very soon, the most horrifying monster menace ever conceived will be oozing into this theater. 2 teenagers see it first, like a falling star from outer space.
Oh, that was close. Come on, I want to see if I can find it.
An old man finds it, touches it, and this is the shocking result. From then on, there's no stopping the blob as it spreads from town to town. It's indestructible. It's indescribable. Nothing can stop it.
This town is in danger.
How can it be stopped? Mob hysteria sweeps one city. Before long, the nation, and then the world could fall before the blood-curdling threat of the mob.
Starring Steve McQueen and a cast of exciting young people.
So, the blob. And what is the blob today? Well, the blob today is the US foreign policy establishment that emerged during the Cold War. The chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan exposed the shortcomings of views within the foreign policy establishment, also known as the blob. The blob involves all of those vast vested interests in bureaucracies, in government bureaucracies. You're going to read about the foreign policy, State Department bureaucracy, the military bureaucracy, all of the vast bureaucracies that emerged during the Cold War during containment to contain the Soviet Union everywhere, in Korea, in Asia, in Africa, including the economic containment elements, as well as the military security containment elements, and the think tanks and analysts that emerged to explain and justify and conceptualize containment. And then the college professors who get benefits and jobs from talking about structural neorealism and American hegemony and so on. The blob turns on Jake. Jake is the National Security Advisor, President Biden, who's being blamed for the chaotic withdrawal of Afghanistan. What is this blob of which they speak that failed in Afghanistan? What does it have to do with the Taliban take over Afghanistan and whether they can actually govern? And why, like the nebulous malevolent organism in the 1955 horror film with which it shares a name, is it perpetually lurking around, sucking up everything in its path? Because of the vast military industrial complex and all of the vast vested interests, both of organizations and the millions of people whose careers and incomes and jobs depend upon this belief that American global influence is necessary and benign and good. The term blob is generally understood to describe members of the mainstream foreign policy establishment, government officials, academics, Council of Foreign Relations panelists, television talking heads, like I showed you with Hans Morgenthau, and the like, who share a collective belief in the obligation of the United States to pursue an aggressive interventionist policy in the post 9/11 world. So 20 years after the September 11 attacks on the US, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are seen in this context as blob approved. Keep in mind those 19 hijackers, right, that hijacked those planes 20 years ago, they were college educated, English speaking, middle class Arabs. For the most part, 15 of whom came from Saudi Arabia, America's closest ally in the Middle East. They weren't poor, poverty-stricken, angry, illiterate people. They were college-educated, English speakers, or living and working primarily in Germany. Expatriates in Germany. And supposedly the Islamic State fighters in Afghanistan fighting the Taliban who want to promote an Islamic caliphate, according to one person I heard interviewed on Democracy Now!, those supporters of the Islamic State Khorasan in Afghanistan, they tend to be college educated people. They're not Taliban rural peasants. They're urban college educated intellectuals. But back to the blob. This foreign policy philosophy has its origins as a post-World War II view of American exceptionalism, epitomized by officials like Dean G. Acheson, who was Harry Truman's Secretary of State, that US military intervention in foreign conflicts was vital to defending American interests and generally did more good than harm. To the extent that the blob holds this view, the Afghanistan withdrawal was a defeat for its position. For blob critics, it was more fodder for discussing why the blob gets things so wrong. Coming out of Afghanistan was a rebuke to, or the swan song of the neoconservative approach, which had its heyday during this Iraq war, that we should spread democracy if necessary by getting rid of cruel gangsters like Saddam Hussein and Slobodan Milosevic, and if necessary, Kim Jong-il and now his son, Kim Jong-un, said Vali Nasser, a professor of Middle East Studies and International Affairs at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. After the first Iraq war, the United States developed a sense that the United States could basically engage in war and help shape outcomes internationally at little or no cost. And it goes on here. Former President George W. Bush positioned a group of ragtag terrorists as America's great strategic rival and an existential threat to the United States, Mr. Nasser continued. Even though the effort failed early on and continued unimpeded and became fundamental to the blob's thinking post 9/11. The term was coined in 2016 by Benjamin J. Rhodes, who was Deputy National Security Advisor for President Barack Obama at the time. It was not a compliment. Rather, it was a criticism directed at foreign policy experts with an unrealistic set of assumptions about what America could do in the world. Mr. Rhodes, who is now a co-host of the Pod Save the World podcast, said in an interview. It's not that people are issued a card with their name on it that identifies them as part of the blob, he said. But back in 2016, he singled out Hillary Clinton, Robert Gates, and other Iraq war promoters with both parties, who, he said, had an unpleasant tendency to whine incessantly about the collapse of American security order. So you can read the rest of the articles on your own, and they keep playing with this blob, blob, blob. Who's more blobbier? Who's blobbish? They're all blobbyish. That's the point that's made, right? That they're all part of the foreign policy establishment. Some people are more cautious than others, but they're all advocating some kind of intensive American engagement with the outside world, justifying America's involvement and activity around the world. Let me see if this is the one I wanted to highlight here. So, stereotyping is a tendency that actors have, that human beings have. So during the Cold War, we talked briefly at the beginning of the semester about the diabolical enemy stereotype, right? That the Soviet Union is like Mordor in the Lord of the Rings, and Stalin is like Sauron in the Lord of the Rings. It's a stereotype, right? And so we talk about the diabolical enemy stereotype here. And I think you can see this. I have to make sure, maybe if I stop share and share you the screen again, so you can look at this. And keep in mind, I'm giving you secrets here because I'm claiming that stereotyping is law-like in its tendencies, particularly with nation states like the United States, China, Japan, Russia. And so they more likely to engage this kind of stereotype. So when you see an enemy, you don't just see an adversary, you see a diabolical evil actor whose decision-making is a black box. It's completely highly rational and cynical. This is the stereotype of the Soviet Union that Ronald Reagan called the evil empire in 1983. Its capability is derived from the fact that we're a democracy, that we expect people to have the right to participate, to express their point of view, and have elections. Stalin doesn't have to worry about any of that. Stalin just issues an order, and his vast slave empire of servants implements his world strategy for domination. And so you see the world in terms of good versus evil, the communist world versus the free world, heaven versus hell, the kingdom of light versus the kingdom of darkness, a Manichaean world, a bipolar view of the world. And those are the terms during the Cold War. There was the free world that included Park Chung-hee and Ferdinand Marcos and Augusto Pinochet. Not very nice guys, but hey, they're fighting the surrogate servants of the evil empire. Kim Il-sung, Fidel Castro, these are, and you have to pick, right? You can't be in the middle. You can't be neutral in this. You can't be part of the third world. You have to choose against the forces of evil or the forces of good. And if you say, no, I'm individual, I'm neutral, I'm not aligned. You're part of this highly rational conspiracy because you say you're part of the Nine Line movement, but you're really not. You're trying to hide your service for radical, godless, totalitarian communism. And if you don't see the Soviet Union in this way, you're at worst a traitor, or at most you're a fool, a dupe. Like you're a Mossadegh. You don't understand what these Iranian communists will do if you don't send the police on them and crush them. And so when we look at this, this file that I opened, and make sure you can see it, this is the height of the Cold War. And again, the dominant view in the United States is that we won the Cold War. We saved the world. And I have to try to see if I can get you to see this, go back to it. That we saved the world. That Ronald Reagan was right. It says you can see this. I think you can see this, right?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. So in terms of the ideal typical diabolical enemy, here is position A. And who's at position A? The right-wing intelligentsia, the neoconservatives. And who are these people? Sorry?
Sorry, no, I thought you meant the
Okay,
Word
yeah.
file.
I've got so many files opened up that the computer is having trouble Let me see if this will work now. Let me close this. Let me close this. So I think you can see this now, right? No, that's not the one I want. I think you can see it now. Yes. Okay. And so that guy that was interviewing Hans Morgenthau in that video television clip I showed you, Willie Math Buckley on firing line, he's here. He was the most influential right-wing commentator in National Review magazine. This is him. He was interviewing Hans Morgenthau in terms of his view of the Cold War. He was more here in terms of understanding complexity in the foreign policy decision-making of the United States or the Soviet Union. What is somebody who's not crazy, who's not stereotyping? What do they see? They see, let me see if I can go back to. They see complexity. And complexity is reality, right? Complexity is, I think I have it here, right? Somebody who sees complexity in the foreign policy making process of a target state, that person who sees complexity, doesn't stereotype, describes rather than judges the motivations as evil or good. And that person who sees complexity sees a number of component interests or motivations in coming up with a policy in that target country that I'm adopting a strategy towards. Coming up with a policy in Moscow or Beijing or Rome or Berlin or Paris or Washington is difficult. It involves politics. It involves reconciling competing constituencies and groups with their competing worldviews. The decisional locus in the target, the leadership of Beijing or Moscow or Washington or Berlin or Paris, that leadership provides some coordination for a large number of competing functional organizations in the Defense Department, in the intelligence agencies, in the business community, in the Treasury Ministry, in the Foreign Trade Ministry, and all of these organizations that have an international interest. The decisional style of that target, it's incremental. All of these vast organizations, they have standard operating procedures in place built upon policies that already exist. And when they face a new challenge, they try to take the existing policy and change it a little bit to make it fit the new problem. So policies build upon other policies with slight incremental changes, right? These organizations are filled with thousands, maybe millions of people who work in them, each with their own little area of responsibility. They're not thinking about the Cold War, containment, mutual misperception of belligerent intent. That's if you want to talk in those terms and study the world, become a college professor. If you become a bureaucrat in a foreign ministry, that's not your job. Your job is to do what you're told, and your job is focused on a very small area of responsibility and get it done today or by 12 o'clock before lunch. And this is millions of people confront that and adds up to an incremental policies built upon what already existed with thousands of people and histories of years and money invested in the policies. That's the blob. That's the blob that believes America's expansion collectively believes that American expansion is good, that American hegemony is good, that America is different from other hegemons, that America won the Cold War, and America should win in Afghanistan, and America was attacked by terrorists who hate our way of life because we're good, because look what we did to South Korea and Japan and Western Europe. And Israel is part of this blob, and the pro-Israel lobby is part of this blob. And the capability sees a full range of objective factors, including the capability, motivational capabilities. And so I wanted to show you one example of this blob regarding the Israel lobby playing its important role. This person has been around for decades. As soon as I can open up the file and then share it with you. This person has been the main advocate or one of the main advisors for Republican and Democratic administrations advocating America's involvement in the Middle East. And that is Dennis Ross. And I think you can see this now, right? And this is he's writing right after the fall of Kabul. America should not withdraw. America has had setbacks before, but America continues to provide leadership in the Middle East. Israel could not exist without American close support. You understand? That's the point I'm trying to make. And so He is always advocating, not because he's an evil guy, but because he's an American and he loves Israel, that America must stay involved in the Middle East. President Biden declared America is back. Going forward, it will be important to show that the United States is not walking away from its responsibilities, that it will not brook challenges, that America needs to reaffirm its commitments. Second, the administration must discuss a long-term plan for the greater Middle East with European allies and other regional stakeholders. This is not the time to shift forces out of the area, including those in Iraq and Syria. The United States cannot allow ISIS or other armed organizations to regroup. Instead, the United States must clearly explain American aims in the Middle East, what America will be prepared to do to fulfill them, and roles it needs to play. It needs its allies to play. So we've had setbacks before, but do not despair, America. We were set back in Vietnam, but we won. We came back from that setback and we won the Cold War and so on. And this guy has been around for over 30 years making that argument, Dennis Ross. And it doesn't matter if the Democratic administration or Republican administration, he is the point man for the Israel lobby, one of them. Okay, so on that scale, let me ask you to vote as the last thing we're going to do today. So I give you some participation credit. And so please vote on this question. Please respond. The American strategy has done more good for the world than bad since 1945. So please vote. So we have 8, 9, 10. I think that's everybody. So agree. I mean, okay. So we have one person disagrees. Okay. Well, that's it for today. And I will post everything I showed you on the course website. Any questions? If not, see you on Friday.